On the morning of February 14, 1879, in a modest farming settlement within Shari County, New York, three neighbors forced open the frozen door of a single-story clapboard residence. Inside, they discovered something that three separate physicians, two county coroners, and a professor of medicine from Albany would, for the rest of their lives, steadfastly refuse to explain. A woman of 26 years had been reduced from her shoulders downward into a fine, pale gray ash. Remarkably, this ash retained the exact silhouette of her body pressed against the floorboards. Her head, her left forearm, and a single stocking-clad foot remained entirely pristine. The chair she had been occupying showed only minimal scorching, and the wooden planks beneath her bore a dark oval stain no larger than a serving platter. Not a single curtain, book, nor the oil lamp positioned merely 3 feet from her elbow had caught fire. Her name was Ruth Payne. The events that transpired within that locked house on the coldest night of that winter were reported in 4 county newspapers, debated across at least 11 medical journals, and then, within 18 months, deliberately expunged from every official record the county possessed. Before we proceed further into Ruth Payne's story and the house on Cobble Hollow Road, if you are listening to this narrative, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us which state or city you are joining us from tonight. We are eager to know where our audience resides because what you are about to hear was nearly lost to history forever. The individuals who sought to bury it possessed more reasons than you could imagine and wielded more power than you would care to believe any handful of ordinary men could ever hold. To comprehend what occurred to Ruth Payne, one must first understand the place she inhabited. The location itself functions as a character in this tale. Without it, everything that follows would make little sense. Shari County in the late 1870s was a mosaic of Dutch stone dwellings and Yankee clapboard farms nestled within the folded hills west of Albany. A region of lengthy valleys and quick tempers. German Palatine families, who had arrived 150 years prior, still spoke a rough, low dialect at home, reserving English solely for church and market. The land was ancient by American standards, settled before the Revolution, and cleared of its oak and hickory by the grandfathers of the current farmers. In numerous places, the stone walls demarcating pasture edges were already subsiding back into the earth. The county seat was a sleepy town comprising shops, a courthouse, and a dairy exchange. However, the hamlet where Ruth resided, a cluster of 7 houses and a Methodist chapel, locally known as Cobble Hollow, was absent from most maps. It lay at the terminus of a wagon road rendered impassable between December and March. During winter, the sole route out was a sled track cutting north across a frozen brook toward the mill at Breaka. Cobble Hollow was the sort of place where a family could vanish into the snow without anyone in the county offices noticing for a month, and where the inhabitants had long since learned to prefer that isolation. The winter of 1878-1879 was, by every contemporary account, the harshest in 40 years. The thermometer at the Breaka post office recorded 28 degrees below zero on the night Ruth Payne died, and snowfall had been intermittent since the first week of November. The drifts against the chapel's north side stood taller than a man, and the cow-shed roof at the Keys farm collapsed under their weight in early January. Children were not sent to the one-room school for weeks at a time. Elderly men perished in their sleep and were stored wrapped in canvas in cold parlors until the ground thawed sufficiently for burial. It was a winter that bore down on the hamlet like the palm of a massive hand, and those who lived through it would speak of it decades later, as if it had been a single unending night from which no one fully awakened. Ruth had arrived in Cobble Hollow 3 years earlier as a young bride. She was born Ruth Vosberg in the Mohawk Valley, daughter of a Dutch Reformed minister who had succumbed to consumption when she was 19. She had taught school in Amsterdam, New York, for 2 winters before meeting Daniel Payne at a Grange Hall dance in the autumn of 1875. Her father had been a stern man, a preacher of the old predestinarian school, who had taught Ruth to read Latin and Greek. Before she turned 12, her mother had died when Ruth was 5, leaving behind a single daguerreotype of a dark-haired young woman in a lace collar and a small collection of poetry books that Ruth carried with her, tied in a bundle with a ribbon, everywhere she went for the rest of her life. Daniel Payne was 9 years her senior, a widower with a stone farmhouse and 90 acres of pasture, inherited from his father. He was a quiet man whose first wife had died in childbirth 2 years prior. By all surviving accounts, he was a decent and hard-working farmer, a deacon of the Methodist chapel, a man who drank nothing stronger than cider, and one known in the hamlet for his patience in breaking horses to harness. Ruth accepted his proposal within 4 months of meeting him, moving her few trunks of books and linens into the Payne farmhouse in the spring of 1876. Those who knew her in Cobble Hollow described her in the careful phrases, farming communities, reserve for women they cannot quite place. She was too educated for a farmer's wife, they said. She read books late into the night by the kitchen lamp, its yellow glow visible from the road, until 2 or 3 in the morning. A small, steady square against the immense darkness of the surrounding hills. She kept a journal in a cedar box beside her bed. She had studied French at the Amsterdam Academy and corresponded through letters carried by mail coach and rail with at least 3 women in Albany and 1 in New York City whose names did not appear in any church register in the county. She was not unfriendly. She attended chapel every Sunday morning, sitting in the 3rd pew from the front with gloved hands folded over a small black prayer book, and she sang in a thin but surprisingly sweet soprano that carried over the deeper voices of the farmers around her. She brought preserves to the sick and taught the small Cobble Hollow Sunday school class of 7 children, who, by the account of one woman who had been among them and lived until 1937, adored her with the peculiar, fierce loyalty rural children reserve for any adult who treats them as if they might one day become interesting. Yet she was not entirely embraced. The neighbors would later tell the coroner that there was a stillness in her they did not know how to handle. She had a way of observing a conversation from a slight distance, as if listening for something beneath the words, which made the older women of the hamlet uneasy without their being able to articulate why. There was also something else, something only 2 of her neighbors would voice aloud, and only after considerable hesitation, and only after the doctor from Albany had sat across from them at their own kitchen tables, asking the same quiet, patient questions 3 and 4 times over. In the last 6 months of her life, Ruth Payne had changed. She had grown thinner, her cheekbones more prominent, and dark hollows appeared beneath her eyes that had not been there the previous summer. She had stopped wearing her wedding bonnet to church, replacing it with a plain black shawl drawn over her head in the manner of a much older woman. She had been seen twice walking alone along the frozen brook at dusk, in weather no sensible woman should have braved, her arms wrapped tightly around her body, her breath trailing white in the cold air. On 3 separate occasions, the woman living in the nearest house, a widow brewer of 60, 2 years, who had buried 2 husbands, raised 5 sons, and did not, by her own description, miss much of what transpired in the hamlet, had heard raised voices emanating from the Payne farmhouse in the hours after midnight. Ruth's voice, the widow said, and Daniel's, and sometimes a third voice, a man's, that the widow did not initially recognize. On each of those occasions, she had stood at her own bedroom window in her nightgown, looking out across the snowy yard toward the Payne house. She had seen a single square of yellow light burning in the kitchen window and shadows moving across it in a way she would later describe as resembling a slow and terrible dance. Each time she had gone back to bed, pulled the quilt around her shoulders, and pretended she had heard nothing at all. A widow of 60, in a hamlet of 7 houses, does not interfere with what happens in another woman's kitchen in the middle of the night. Even when the sounds carried through the winter air are sounds she does not want to hear. She would regret that silence, she would later tell Dr. Tanika on the back porch of her own house on a July afternoon, for every remaining day of her life. But regret, she would add in the same breath, was a poor kind of penance, and the Lord would judge her for what she had not done, just as He would judge the others for what they had. The morning of February 14th began for Daniel Payne at 3:45, when the cold woke him in the upstairs bedroom and he discovered his wife was not beside him. This was not unusual in itself. Ruth had been sleeping poorly for weeks and had taken to going downstairs in the small hours to sit by the kitchen stove and read. Daniel dressed in the dark, pulling on wool trousers over his long drawers and lacing the heavy boots he wore against the cold floors. He came down the narrow staircase with a kerosene lantern held before him. The house was utterly silent. The parlor, as he passed through, was dark and still, its sheet-covered furniture looming like pale, crouching animals in the lantern light. The kitchen door at the far end of the parlor was closed. Daniel later swore under 3 separate examinations by 3 different officials that when he opened that door, the room beyond was not merely cool, as a farmhouse kitchen often was in the hours before dawn, but bitterly cold, the cold of a room where no fire had burned for hours. The stove, a heavy cast, iron Union box stove with nickel-plated trim that Daniel had bought at the county fair in 1876, had gone out during the night. The oil lamp on the table was extinguished, its wick black and curled. The window above the dry sink was clouded, with a thin film of frost on the inside, and fern-like crystals had grown across the lower panes in delicate, repeating patterns. And, in the rocking chair beside the stove, where Ruth habitually sat in the mornings to drink her tea, there was a shape his mind at first refused to accept. He said he stood in the doorway for a long time, holding the lantern, before he understood what he was looking at. His wife's head was leaning back against the chair's spindles, her eyes closed, her dark hair loose about her shoulders, her expression in the flickering lantern light entirely peaceful. Her left arm lay draped over the chair's arm, the hand white and intact, a small silver ring on the 4th finger. The ring her father had given her on her 16th birthday. Her right stocking foot was extended forward, as if she had been in the act of rising, and everything else, everything between the base of her neck and her ankles, was gone. In its place, filling the seat of the rocking chair and spreading across the floorboards in a neat oval measuring, the coroner would later record, 31 inches by 19 inches was a deposit of fine, pale gray ash. The ash held at its center the unmistakable curve of a rib cage, the suggestion of a pelvis, the bent line of a femur. It was, Daniel said, as if his wife had been poured into the chair and the chair had retained her shape. He did not scream. He did not run. He stood for what felt like a very long time, then turned around, walked back through the parlor, opened the front door, and traversed the 3/4 of a mile through knee-deep snow to the widow brewer's house, where he asked her, in a voice she described as utterly calm, if she would be so good as to come and look at something. The widow came. She was not a woman who required much persuading. When a neighbor appeared at her door before dawn, she brought with her the hired man from the adjoining farm, a Palatine German named Just Keys, who had been awake in the barn milking his cows by lantern light. Just brought his younger brother Hendrik, who rode the sled track north to Breka to fetch the doctor. By 10 in the morning, 4 men and the widow were standing in the Payne kitchen, and none of them could speak. The kitchen by daylight was almost ordinary, a square room, perhaps 14 feet on a side, with a plank floor worn smooth by 3 generations of Payne feet, a large pine table in the center, a dry sink against the east wall, a cupboard against the north wall containing the household's modest dishes, and the cast iron stove against the south wall, its belly cold, its door closed, its small brass draft lever at the base still open to the position Ruth must have set before falling asleep. Above the stove, on a wooden rack, hung a row of copper pans polished to a dull shine. Against the west wall, beneath a window curtained with unbleached muslin, stood the rocking chair, and in the rocking chair was what remained of Ruth Payne. Dr. Hendrik van Dusen, who had arrived from Breka just after 9, was a country physician of 54 years, a graduate of the Fairfield Medical College in central New York, a man who had delivered perhaps 400 babies, set perhaps 1,000 broken bones, and signed perhaps 600 death certificates in his career. He had seen, he believed, every way a human being could die in Shari County. He had not seen this. The stove, he noted in his report that afternoon in careful pencil, was stone cold to the touch. He laid his hand flat on its top for a full minute to be certain. The floor around the oval of ash was unburned. The wooden arms of the rocking chair were scorched only where they would have been in contact with the body, and the scorching was shallow, not more than 1/8 of an inch deep, as if someone had passed a hot iron lightly over the wood, and then withdrawn it. The curtain at the window, 2 feet from the chair, was intact. A stack of kindling in the wood box beside the stove, 3 feet from the chair, was intact. A folded copy of the previous week's Shari Republican, on the table 4 feet from the chair, was intact. The doctor was able to read the headline about a proposed extension of the railroad to Cobble Skill without turning the paper over, and Ruth Payne's head, hair, face, and eyelashes were, the doctor wrote in the careful hand of a man trying very hard not to commit himself to any conclusion he could not defend, perfectly preserved, as if she had fallen asleep in her chair and never woken up. There was no grimace of pain, no soot on her cheeks. The small silver cross she wore on a chain around her neck had fallen back into the neckline of her nightdress. And the chain itself was intact and bright. The temperature required to reduce a human torso to calcined ash is not a matter of medical opinion, but of physics. A cremation furnace in 1879 operated at a minimum of 1400 degrees Fahrenheit and required between 2 and 3 hours of sustained, directed heat to reduce a body to the condition in which Ruth Payne was found. No fire of that intensity could have burned within 3 feet of unscorched wood. No fire of that duration could have left her face and hair untouched, and no fire known to medical science in the winter of 1879 could have confined itself so precisely to the soft tissue of a single human trunk. The doctor closed his notebook. The widow crossed herself in the Catholic manner, though she was a lifelong Methodist, and only afterward realized she had done it. Just Keys, who had fought at Gettysburg as a boy of 19 and had seen men burned in the aftermath of that battle, walked outside into the snow and was sick against the side of the barn. When he came back inside, his face was gray and he did not meet anyone's eye. There was a discussion that afternoon among the men in the kitchen. Dr. Van Dusen wanted to send for the county sheriff. Just Keyes, whose English was rough but whose judgment was sound, agreed. Daniel Payne, sitting on a stool in the corner with his hands folded between his knees and his eyes fixed on the floor, said quietly that he did not want his wife's remains, what was left of her, to become a public spectacle. He said she had been a modest woman and would not have wanted to be stared at. In the same quiet voice, he said, he believed the affliction that had taken her was a medical accident of a rare and terrible kind, and that the proper authority to consult was not the sheriff but the coroner, who could make his determination without the presence of curious neighbors. Dr. Van Dusen, who had watched Daniel closely through this speech, later wrote in a private letter to a colleague in Utica that he had never in 30 years of country practice seen a recently widowed man speak about his wife's remains with such precise and premeditated calm, and that if he had been a man of suspicious temperament, he might have taken that calm as a kind of evidence. But he was not a man of suspicious temperament. He was a tired country doctor, in the middle of the hardest winter of his life, standing in a kitchen where something impossible had happened. He accepted the husband's wishes, sent Hendrik Keyes north again on the sled track, not for the sheriff but for the coroner, and sat with Daniel, the widow, and just in the parlor, with the kitchen door closed and a sheet draped over the rocking chair, until the coroner arrived late that evening. By then, the ash had begun, in the dry, cold air of the kitchen, to sift very slightly through the cracks between the floorboards. In the weeks that followed, the story of what had happened in the Payne kitchen spread through Shari County the way cold spreads through a stone wall. Slowly, and from every direction at once, the Shari Republican ran a brief notice on February 16th, describing the death as a sudden misfortune of unexplained cause and offering condolences to Deacon Payne. The Cobble Skill Index 3 days later described it as a probable apoplexy followed by accidental fire. The diagnosis Dr. Van Dusen had settled on after 2 sleepless nights, though he himself did not believe it. The Albany Argus, which had a correspondent in the county seat and was willing to risk some sensationalism, printed a longer piece on February 22nd in which the word combustion appeared for the first time, qualified carefully by the adjective spontaneous. The piece was reprinted in edited form in 3 other regional papers over the following week. The story might have ended there, filed away as a curiosity in the back pages of a county paper, had it not been for a physician from Albany named Dr. Cornelis Tenike, who read the Argus piece over his breakfast coffee on the morning of February 23rd, and by that same evening was on the train west, with a leather satchel full of instruments, and an unshakable conviction that he had just been handed the case that would make his career. Dr. Tenike was 44 years old, a professor of forensic medicine at the Albany Medical College, and a man whose professional ambition was matched only by his contempt for country doctors. He had published 7 papers on unusual modes of death, including a widely cited study of accidental poisonings among factory workers in Troy, and a controversial monograph on asphyxiation in infants of the urban poor. He had been waiting for more than a decade for a specimen of what the medical literature of the time referred to as preternatural human combustion. There had been, by the count of medical journals in 1879, some 30 documented cases in Europe and North America over the preceding century, almost all involving elderly women, heavy drinkers, and confined spaces. The case of the Countess Cornelia Bandini of Cesena in 1731 was the canonical reference cited in every medical textbook. Ruth Payne at 26, a teetotaler and a woman in visibly good health only days before her death, did not fit the pattern. That, for Dr. Tanique, was precisely the point. He arrived in Cobble Hollow on the morning of February 25th, 11 days after Ruth's death. He traveled from the breaker station by hired, sleigh wrapped in a bearskin robe, his satchel at his feet, and he would later describe the approach to the hamlet as the strangest visual impression of his adult life. The snow had begun again during the night. The 7 houses of Cobble Hollow stood in a rough line along the frozen brook, their dark roofs frosted white, their chimneys smoking in thin gray plumes. Beyond them, the hills rose in a series of long, pale folds under a sky the color of slate. There was no sound except the creak of the sleigh runners and the breath of the horse. Not a dog barked, not a child shouted. The hamlet looked, he wrote, like an engraving from a German fairy tale, the kind in which something terrible has just happened inside one of the small, tidy houses, and no one has yet noticed. He was met at the door of the Payne farmhouse by Daniel, who had not, as far as anyone in the hamlet could tell, wept once in the intervening 11 days. Daniel was a tall man, 6 feet and some inches, with a long, slightly stooped frame typical of someone who had spent most of his adult life bending over plows and fence rails. His hair was sandy brown, thinning at the crown, combed severely back from a high forehead. His eyes were pale blue and widely set, and they possessed the particular flat quality of eyes that had stopped expecting anything. Daniel shook the doctor's hand, took his coat, and led him through the parlor into the kitchen, without speaking a word. That was not strictly necessary. The rocking chair was still there against the west wall, beneath the muslin, curtained window. The oval of ash had been swept up, placed in a sealed wooden box, roughly the size of a hat box, and kept at the coroner's instruction in an unheated outbuilding behind the farmhouse. The scorched floorboards had been scrubbed with lye soap, but not replaced, and the dark oval stain was still clearly visible beneath Daniel's boots. Dr. Tanique set his satchel on the pine table and looked slowly around the kitchen. As he did, he began to notice things the country doctor had missed. Things that would, in the weeks to come, unravel the entire story. He noticed first that the rocking chair was not in its natural position. It had been moved at some point before Ruth's death, perhaps 3 feet forward from the wall into an open area, where there was no obvious reason for anyone to have placed it. The natural position for the chair, given the room's layout and the stove's habitual warmth, was against the wall where it now stood, but the faint wear patterns on the floor showed it had been dragged forward and then returned. He noticed that the cupboard directly behind the chair, a tall pine cupboard with 2 upper and 2 lower doors, contained in its lower compartment a set of ceramic jugs that were, when he lifted one, far lighter than they had any right to be. Daniel, when asked, said they had held coal oil for the lamps, but he had used up the supply during the long winter nights. Dr. Tanique, who had counted the jugs and noted their combined capacity, did not say what he was thinking. He noticed that the floor beneath the rocking chair, where the scorched oval stain was not at the kitchen's center but offset, pushed away from the stove toward the window. He noticed that the rag rug, which had always, according to the widow brewer's later testimony, lain under the rocking chair, had disappeared sometime in the past several months and had not been replaced. He noticed that the small pedestal table that had always stood beside the rocking chair, the table on which Ruth kept her tea and her book, was also missing. Daniel said he had broken it up for kindling in a winter as hard as that one. No one found this remarkable. Dr. Tanique made a small, careful note in his pocketbook and said nothing. Over the next 3 days, Dr. Tinnick measured every surface in the kitchen, collected samples of the ash, interviewed Daniel, the widow brewer, Just Keys, and the Methodist chapel minister. He rode the sled track into Breaka to examine the house where Ruth had grown up before her marriage, and he spent an afternoon in the small records office at the county seat examining deed books, tax rolls, and the marriage register for the past 10 years. What he found, and what he wrote in the unpublished notebook that survived him. Purchased 61 years later by a private collector in Coopertown, has never been reproduced in any medical journal. The notebook runs to 187 pages in Dr. Tinnick's cramped, educated hand and contains, among many other things, 3 observations he would eventually come to see as the pillars on which the entire case rested. The first observation, recorded on the second day of his stay, was that Ruth Payne had, in the final month of her life, purchased from the general store in Breaka a total of 19 gallons of coal oil, a kerosene-based lamp fuel widely used in rural New York at the time. 19 gallons was an amount far exceeding what the Payne household could have consumed for lighting in that period. A normal farmhouse with 3 or 4 lamps in regular use consumed perhaps 2 gallons a month in winter. The Payne household had only 2 lamps. Daniel, when pressed, could not account for the discrepancy. He said his wife had been responsible for household purchases he had not noticed. She had once mentioned a plan to varnish certain furniture in the spring, and he supposed the oil might have been intended for that. Dr. Tinnick wrote a single word in the margin beside this entry, implausible. The second observation, recorded on the third day, was that Ruth had been observed by at least 2 witnesses wearing a corset of a new style recently advertised in Godey's Ladies' Book. A garment whose stays were reinforced with a paste of calcium phosphate and animal fat, a substance Dr. Tinnick noted in careful Latin was highly susceptible to forming phosphorus compounds under prolonged body heat. The corset had been a gift, the widow brewer said. Ruth had shown it to her in October, laid out in its box with a ribbon, and said, in a voice the widow remembered, as unusually quiet, that it had come from a gentleman admirer of many years ago, who had sent it as a token of continued friendship. The widow had not asked who the gentleman was. She had seen Ruth wear the corset on several occasions afterward under a black wool dress. Ruth took to wearing in the evenings, when she expected no visitors. The third observation, the one Dr. Tinnick underlined twice and then, in different ink and at a much later date, circled 3 times, was this: Ruth Payne was, at the time of her death, in the early weeks of a pregnancy. And that pregnancy, according to dates Dr. Tinnick carefully reconstructed from the widow's testimony, and 3 letters he was eventually permitted to read, could not possibly have been her husband's child. If this story is already making you think twice about what people in small towns can hide, take a moment to like this video and let us know in the comments what you think happened in that kitchen, because the records we are about to discuss were sealed for a reason. And what Dr. Tinnick learned next is why that seal was put in place, and why no one in Cobble Hollow or Albany ever spoke Ruth Payne's name again in any public setting for the remainder of the century. Dr. Tinnick returned to Albany on February 28th and began, with the methodical patience of a man who had waited his whole career for exactly this, to assemble the rest of the story. He wrote letters to every address in the bundle of correspondence Daniel had grudgingly allowed him to examine. He interviewed, over the next 4 months, every person in the Mohawk Valley who had known Ruth Vosberg before her marriage. He traveled twice to New York City to consult with a colleague at the Bellevue Hospital Medical College on the chemistry of slow combustion. He spent a week in the Public Records Office of Albany County. He sent a young assistant to copy out from the dusty ledgers of a small printing shop on State Street every name recoverable from the account books of a certain quarterly publication printed there between 1870 and 1875. By the end of the summer of 1879, he had constructed a picture of Ruth Payne's life that was, to anyone who had known only the quiet minister's daughter and dutiful farmer's wife of Cobble Hollow, almost entirely unrecognizable. Ruth Vosberg, before her marriage, had been a member of a small, discreet society in Albany that met in the back rooms of that same printing shop on State Street, and described itself in the letters Dr. Tenique was permitted to copy as a circle for the advancement of rational womanhood. The circle comprised teachers, a handful of unmarried daughters of merchant families, 2 journalists, and 1 physician, a woman named Dr. Harriet de Forest, who had taken her medical degree in Geneva, Switzerland some 20 years earlier and practiced without a license from the state of New York in a consulting room above a milliner's shop on Broadway. The circle read the works of Frances Wright and Margaret Fuller, corresponded with a similar society in Boston and a smaller group in Rochester, associated with the suffragist movement, and produced on a small handpress in the printing shop's back room a quarterly pamphlet called The Reasoned Voice, of which no complete run survives in any public library. In ways the surviving letters only hint at, they provided certain forms of practical assistance to women of the city who found themselves in circumstances the law and churches of Albany would not officially acknowledge. What exactly those forms of assistance were, Dr. Tenique was careful not to set down in writing, even in his private notebook. But from the pattern of the letters, the particular professional credentials of Dr. de Forest, and the fact that 3 women named in the account books had died in the intervening years under circumstances officially recorded as female complaints, any reader familiar with the medical realities of the 1870s could draw his own conclusions. Ruth had left this society abruptly and without explanation in the autumn of 1875, within weeks of meeting Daniel Payne at the Grange Hall dance. Dr. Tenique came to believe she left because she had been seen at a meeting by a man who recognized her and who threatened in some manner, not entirely explicit in the surviving letters, to expose her. Who that man was, Dr. Tenique could not at first determine, but one of the letters he obtained, written to Ruth by Dr. de Forest in November 1878, 3 months before her death, contained a single sentence that eventually led him to the answer. The sentence read, in its entirety, "I fear, dear Ruth, that the gentleman from Cobble Hollow has not forgotten you, and if he should come to the house on Broadway again, I cannot promise that I will be able to send him away a second time." And the gentleman from Cobble Hollow was not Daniel Payne. Daniel, at the time the letter was written, had never been to Albany in his life. The gentleman from Cobble Hollow was, as Dr. Tenique confirmed through the laborious process of tracing property deeds and court records in the Shari County Archive and checking them against the Commercial Directory of Albany, a man named Augustus Voorhees, 48 years old, a textile merchant who owned a substantial summer house 3 miles from the Payne farm and spent the months of June through September in the hamlet each year. Augustus Voorhees was a man of considerable local reputation, the 3rd generation of a Dutch merchant family trading wool and cotton out of Albany since before the War of 1812. A member of the Albany Chamber of Commerce, a trustee of 2 banks, a communicant of the Second Reformed Church, and owner of a 4-story brick house on Washington Avenue in the better part of the city. He was married to a woman of fragile health who rarely left the Washington Avenue house, and he had 3 grown daughters, all married to respectable men. By every measurable standard of the 1870s, He was a man of unblemished public character. He was also, and this was the detail that made Dr. Neek set down his pen and stare out the window of his study on the evening of July 2, 1879, the uncle of Daniel Payne's first wife. He was the man who had introduced Daniel to his first wife 12 years earlier, at a family picnic at his summer house in Cobble Hollow. He was the man who had paid out of his own pocket for in the carved marble headstone in the Cobble Hollow churchyard, over that first wife's grave. He was the man who had, by the widow brewer's testimony, when Dr. Tennick pressed her a second time, been seen entering the Payne farmhouse on at least 4 occasions during the summer and autumn of 1878, always while Daniel was out in the far pasture, always staying for more than an hour, and always leaving without speaking to anyone in the hamlet. And he was the man whose voice the widow would eventually confess to Dr. Tennick in a whispered conversation on her back porch on the afternoon of July 15, 1879. She had recognized as the third voice, raised in argument in the Payne farmhouse, in the small hours of the night. 3 times in the final months of Ruth's life. Dr. Tennick was not by temperament a man who jumped to conclusions. He spent the autumn of 1879 assembling what he had learned into a careful scientific monograph, intending to present it before the Albany Academy of Medicine in January of the following year. The monograph argued, with great care and an abundance of chemical diagrams, that Ruth Payne had died of a rare but not unprecedented conjunction of physiological and environmental circumstances. It proposed that the calcium phosphate in her corset stays, warmed by prolonged body heat and by the vapors of the 19 gallons of coal oil stored in a cupboard directly behind her chair, had undergone a slow chemical transformation, producing small quantities of white phosphorus. It proposed that this phosphorus ignited either by a stray ember from the stove or by a frictional spark from her own movement in the chair, initiating a slow combustion confined to the fatty tissues of her torso, a process similar to what was then known among undertakers as the wick effect. It proposed, in its final pages, and with considerable delicacy, that the unusually low body temperature of a woman in the first weeks of pregnancy, combined with the unusually low ambient temperature of that February night, had somehow permitted the combustion to proceed without igniting the surrounding materials. It was, in its way, a remarkable piece of work. It was also, by the standards of any modern forensic pathologist, almost entirely wrong, and Dr. Tennick, in the last weeks of 1879, was beginning to suspect as much himself. Because in the course of writing the monograph, he had returned to Cobble Hollow one final time on December 12, 1879, nearly 10 months after Ruth's death, and had interviewed for 2 hours in the back parlor of the widow brewer's house a hired girl named Margaret Keyes, the 15-year-old niece of Just Keyes, who had worked in the Payne kitchen 3 days a week throughout the autumn of 1878. Margaret was a slight, dark-haired girl who spoke English only haltingly and had refused to speak to Dr. Van Duzen in February and to Dr. Tennick on either of his previous visits. She had changed her mind, she told the widow, because she had begun to have dreams. In the dreams, she was standing in the snow outside the Payne farmhouse, and Ruth Payne was looking at her through the kitchen window, trying to tell her something Margaret could not hear. The dreams came every night. Margaret said she had not slept through a night since early summer. She was losing weight, and her mother, who did not know the reason, had begun to fear for her health. Margaret said she had decided to speak finally because she believed that if she did not, the dreams would kill her the way the hamlet's silence had killed Ruth Payne. What Margaret told him, in low Palatine German that the widow translated sentence by sentence, changed everything. Margaret said that on the evening of February 13th, The night before Ruth was found dead, she had been sent to the Payne farmhouse at dusk to deliver a jar of preserves from her aunt. It had been snowing lightly. The last daylight was fading from the sky, and the path between the houses had been trackless. So Margaret took almost half an hour to cover a distance that would normally have taken 10 minutes. She had knocked at the front door, and no one answered. She waited, knocked again more loudly, her knuckles stinging in the cold, and thought she heard through the heavy door the sound of a man's voice speaking sharply in the kitchen. But she could not be sure. No one came to the door. She walked around the side of the house to the kitchen window, intending to leave the jar on the porch, where Mrs. Payne would see it in the morning. Through the kitchen window, the window above the dry sink, whose curtain on that evening was drawn back rather than closed, Margaret saw 3 people inside. Ruth Payne sat in the rocking chair. Daniel Payne stood by the stove with his back to her, his broad shoulders hunched, his arms folded tight across his chest in the posture, Margaret said, of a man making himself stand still. And a third man, a man Margaret had seen in the hamlet the previous summer at a social gathering at the summer house, whom she knew to be Augustus Voorhees, stood directly in front of Ruth with something in his hands. Margaret could not see clearly what it was, only that it was small and dark, and that Augustus Voorhees was leaning forward, speaking to Ruth in a voice too low to hear through the glass. Ruth was looking up at him, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her hands folded in her lap, and her face wore an expression Margaret had never seen on a grown woman's face before. An expression she described, fumbling for the word in her 2 poor languages, as the look of a rabbit that has just understood the snare. The 3 figures held that tableau for several seconds. Then Augustus Voorhees reached out with one hand and took hold of Ruth's wrist, and Ruth did not pull away, and Daniel did not turn around. Augustus spoke a single word, Margaret thought, in a harder and louder voice than before, though the glass muffled it. Ruth nodded once and closed her eyes. Margaret ran back to her aunt's house without leaving the preserves. The jar was later found frozen solid in a snowdrift at the edge of the Payne property, where Margaret had dropped it in her flight. She said she had not told anyone, not even her aunt, because Augustus Voorhees had once given her father a loan during a bad harvest year that her father had not yet repaid, and because a girl of 15 in Cobble Hollow in 1878 did not accuse a wealthy merchant from Albany of anything. She said she was telling him now, the doctor from the city, because she could not sleep, and because the face she had seen through the kitchen window had become the face she saw behind her own eyelids every night, and because she believed, though she could not prove it and did not expect him to believe her, that whatever had happened in that kitchen after she ran away had not been an accident, had not been a natural thing, and had not been anything the chemistry in the doctor's books would ever be able to explain. Just when we thought we had understood what happened to Ruth Payne, the horror in Cobble Hollow begins to take a different shape entirely. If this story holds you in its grip, share this video with someone who loves the darker corners of American history. Hit that like button to support what we do here, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now let us follow Dr. Payne into the last act of this tragedy, because what he did with what Margaret told him is perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire case, and the part that, for more than a century, no one was willing to put on the public record. Dr. Payne returned to Albany on the evening of December 14, 1879, carrying in his satchel the notes of his interview with Margaret Keyes and a small muslin bag containing a sample of the ash swept from the kitchen floor 10 months before. He went directly not to his house on Elk Street, where his wife was waiting with a late supper, but to his laboratory on the second floor of the medical college. Working through the night by the light of 2 gas burners, he performed a series of chemical tests on the ash he had not had the opportunity, or perhaps the motivation, to perform before. He tested for standard combustion residues, for the specific compounds expected from the wick effect theory, and, on a hunch he could not afterward explain, for compounds associated with industrial and military accelerants. What he found by 3 in the morning of December 15th was this: the ash contained, in quantities that could not plausibly be accounted for by the combustion of human tissue alone, measurable traces of potassium nitrate, sulfur, and fine charcoal. The 3 ingredients in the precise proportions Dr. Tanika's tests revealed of black powder. Not the residue of black powder that had been fired in the manner of a firearm or charge, but the residue of black powder that had been burned slowly in the open under controlled conditions, in the manner an apothecary or a pyrochemist might burn it to produce a specific chemical effect or a specific quantity of directed heat. Dr. Tinnake sat at his laboratory bench for a long time that night. He put out the gas burners one after another and sat in the dark. The first gray light of morning found him still sitting there, his hands folded on the bench in front of him. He understood now what had been done to Ruth Payne. He understood that the heat required to reduce her torso to ash in the manner observed, in the time available, without igniting the surrounding room, could only have been produced by a deliberate and expert application of a slow, burning accelerant packed in and around her body, probably while she was unconscious or restrained, and ignited in a manner that directed the heat inward rather than outward. He understood that the wick effect his monograph was about to defend had been a red herring, almost certainly planted deliberately through the calcium phosphate corset and the 19 gallons of coal oil by someone who understood enough of contemporary medical theory to know what investigators would look for and accept as an explanation. He understood that the agent of combustion had been human, not natural. He understood that the work required a knowledge of chemistry a country farmer like Daniel Payne could not have possessed, but that a textile merchant who bought and sold dyestuffs, bleaching agents, and industrial accelerants across 3 states, a man like Augustus Voorhees, could have acquired without great difficulty. And he understood, finally, and with a cold clarity that made him put down his pen and walk out into the snow on State Street at 4 in the morning, that what he had been investigating for the past 10 months was not a case of preternatural combustion at all. It was a murder, executed with extraordinary care, disguised as a wonder of science to ensure no one would ever look for a murderer. He walked that morning from the medical college all the way home to his house on Elk Street, a distance of nearly 2 miles through streets empty, except for the milkman's wagon and a few lamplighters, extinct of the last gas lamps. He did not feel the cold. His mind was working through a series of problems, whose dimensions he was only beginning to grasp. If he made his findings public, what would become of Ruth Payne's memory? Whose affair and pregnancy would become the central fact of the story, and whose killers might well escape prosecution on a technicality of evidence? If he went to the sheriff of Shari County, whom would the sheriff actually investigate in a county where Augustus Voorhees was a political donor of long standing and a personal friend of 2 sitting judges? If he wrote to the district attorney in Albany with evidence consisting of ash, a notebook, and letters from Dr. DeForest, would he be believed? A medical professor pursuing a private theory against a trustee of 2 banks. And behind all these questions, Pressing forward in the dim light of the December morning was a question about himself. Dr. Cornelis Tenake was 44 years old. His career had, until this case, been solid but not brilliant. He had wanted the Albany Medical College chair of forensic medicine for a decade, and had been passed over twice in favor of younger men with better connections. He had 3 children in school, whose fees strained his resources, and an ailing mother in Schenectady, whose care he quietly paid for. He was a man with a family, a reputation, and a mortgage, and he was about to attempt to bring a criminal prosecution against a man who could, with a single letter on the right stationery, destroy every one of those things without leaving visible fingerprints. What Dr. Tenake did next is the part of this story that has been debated by the few scholars who know enough to debate anything for nearly a century and a half. He did not go to the sheriff of Shari County. He did not publish his findings. He did not, as far as any record shows, speak of them to another living soul, not to his wife, not to his colleagues at the medical college, not to the young assistant who had helped prepare the chemical tests and who was afterward sent away on an unexpected teaching assignment in Binghamton. He did, on the morning of December 17, 1879, write a letter to Augustus Voorhees at his residence in Albany. The letter itself has not survived, though Dr. Tenake made reference to it obliquely in a single line of his notebook dated December 17th. The line reads only, "Letter sent to A.V. at the Hamlet. Certain matters laid before him in confidence. Response awaited." But the reply Augustus Voorhees wrote 3 days later, on December 20th, on heavy cream letterhead from the Voorhees Textile Company of Albany, was found folded carefully into the back of Dr. Tenake's private notebook 61 years later when the notebook was purchased at auction. The reply is 11 lines long. It thanks Dr. Tenake for his discretion. It expresses confidence that the doctor understands the painful necessity of certain private arrangements in cases where the reputations of families, the stability of communities, and the honor of the deceased herself are at stake. It promises, in language so courteous it takes a moment to understand what it is promising, that Dr. Tenake's advancement within the medical profession of the state of New York will henceforth be assured. It mentions, as if in passing and almost as an afterthought, that a vacancy has recently opened on the Board of Trustees of the Albany Medical College, and that the board has been considering candidates of suitable distinction, and that the writer's own modest influence with 2 of the sitting trustees would, should the doctor find himself inclined to accept such a position, be placed entirely at his disposal. It closes with the warm regards and high esteem of a loyal friend who looks forward sincerely to their next meeting. Dr. Tenake did not attend the meeting of the Albany Academy of Medicine in January 1880. He did not deliver his monograph. He withdrew the paper from the program without explanation, citing unforeseen circumstances of a personal nature. He filed his notes, folded the letter into the back of his notebook, placed the notebook in a locked drawer of his desk, and in the course of the following year was quietly appointed to the Board of Trustees of the Albany Medical College. He served on that board for 22 years, published 4 more papers on unusual modes of death, none concerning the case of Ruth Payne, and died of a stroke in the spring of 1911 at the age of 66 in his armchair in his study in Albany, with the evening edition of the newspaper folded across his knees. The notebook was found by his granddaughter, a schoolteacher named Elizabeth Tenake, in the bottom of a cedar trunk in the attic of the family home on Elk Street in the summer of 1940, during the emptying of the house after her own father's death. She read it through in a single afternoon, sitting on an overturned box in the dusty heat of the attic. She did not speak of it to her brothers. She sold it 3 months later to a private collector in Coopertown for $75. The collector who bought it was, as it happens, a distant cousin of the Voorhees family of Albany, and the notebook has remained in the collection of his descendants ever since. The records of the Ruth Payne case. The ones that should have been filed in the Shari County Courthouse, including the coroner's report, the physician's affidavit, Daniel Payne's deposition, and the brief sworn statement Just Keys gave 2 days after the body was discovered, do not exist. They did exist once. Dr. Tennick cites them in his notebook with specific file numbers and dates. But in the summer of 1880, 6 months after his appointment to the Medical College Board, the Shari County Courthouse suffered a small fire in its basement archive. The fire was contained to a single storage room, attributed in the county fire marshal's report to a defective kerosene lamp left burning overnight in a corridor outside the archive. It destroyed, according to a brief notice in the Shari Republican on August 9, 1880, a quantity of miscellaneous papers of no great consequence, including the entire coroner's file for February 1879, the entire docket of property transactions involving the Voorhees family for 1877 through 1879, the marriage register for the Cobble Hollow Methodist Chapel for the same period, and the complete run of local tax assessments on the Payne farm for the 5 years preceding Ruth's death. No other records in the archive were damaged. The defective kerosene lamp was never produced as evidence, and the corridor in which it had supposedly been left burning was never, according to testimony from the courthouse janitor, a corridor where any lamp was ever kept. Daniel Payne sold the farm in the autumn of 1880 to a buyer who paid considerably above the market rate and was represented by a law firm with offices on Washington Avenue in Albany, the same firm that had represented the Voorhees Textile Company in matters of incorporation and taxation for the previous 15 years. Daniel moved to a small town in western Pennsylvania called Mercer, where he remarried 2 years later, fathered 3 children, and lived out his life as a respected elder of a Presbyterian congregation. He died in 1914 at age 70. His obituary mentioned a first wife who had died tragically in a house fire in New York State, but did not name her. His second wife, according to a granddaughter interviewed by a folklorist in 1968, said only that Daniel had been a good husband, but a silent one, and that in his last years he had taken to sitting up in the kitchen until 2 or 3 in the morning alone, with a single lamp burning, looking at nothing. Once, the granddaughter said, her grandmother had come downstairs to find him weeping silently, his face in his hands. When she put her arm around his shoulders and asked what was wrong, he said only, "I did not turn around. I should have turned around." He never explained what he meant, nor said it again. Augustus Voorhees continued to summer in Cobble Hollow for another 15 years. He expanded the textile company, opened a second office in Boston, and served 1 term in the New York State Senate, where his principal legislative achievement was a bill raising penalties for the corruption of public morals. He endowed, in 1893, a chair in moral philosophy at a small college in Shari County, the endowment stipulating that the holder was to deliver once each year a public lecture on the Christian virtues of temperance, chastity, and reserve. He died in 1909 at age 70, 8 of complications following minor surgery, and is buried beneath a white marble monument in the Cobble Hollow churchyard, within sight of the smaller, weathered stone marking Ruth Payne's grave. The inscription on his monument reads, "A merchant of integrity, a friend of virtue, a pillar of the community." The inscription on Ruth's stone, which Daniel ordered before selling the farm and leaving for Pennsylvania, reads only, "Ruth Payne, wife 1852 to 1879. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. The widow brewer died in 1884 of pneumonia at age 67. She had kept until the end a sealed envelope in the top drawer of her bureau, addressed to the Shari County District Attorney. Its contents never disclosed to her family and, when discovered after her death, opened by her eldest son and thrown into the kitchen stove without being read aloud. Margaret Keyes married a farmer from the next county in 1883, raised 5 children, and lived until 1931. Her neighbors regarded her as unusually quiet, and in the last year of her life, she was recorded by a granddaughter as saying, without context, that there were things a person could see through a kitchen window that they should never have seen, and that they never afterward stopped seeing. Dr. Tenique's notebook is today in the archive of a small private historical society in upstate New York that has chosen not to permit its reproduction or public display on the grounds, according to a statement issued by the Society's Board of Trustees in 1987, that the document contains material of a deeply sensitive nature concerning identifiable families of the region whose descendants continue to live in the county. The ash of Ruth Payne, in its sealed wooden box, was buried in an unmarked corner of the Cobble Hollow churchyard in the summer of 1880 at the instruction of the then presiding minister of the Methodist chapel, whose name has not survived because the pages of the chapel register covering 1878 through 1881 were, like the coroner's file at the courthouse, destroyed at some point in the late 19th century. What was done to Ruth Payne on the night of February 13, 1879, was done by at least 2 men in a locked kitchen on the coldest night of a hard winter, in a hamlet at the end of a road the snow had closed. It was done to a young woman who, before her marriage, had belonged to a circle of other young women who believed the future would be different from the past, and who had chosen, when threatened, to leave that circle and accept a quiet life in a place where no one would ever come looking for her. It was done almost certainly because she was pregnant with a child, not her husband's, and because the father of that child was a man who could not afford, at age 40, 8 with a sick wife on Washington Avenue, 3 married daughters, and a reputation built over 3 generations of careful Dutch commerce to have the fact known. It was done with chemistry borrowed from the textile trade, potassium nitrate, sulfur, and fine charcoal packed around the body of an unconscious woman in a rocking chair. It was disguised as a wonder of science to ensure that the only people who might investigate would be so dazzled by the prospect of a medical sensation they would not think to look for a criminal. It was compounded by the quiet cooperation of a husband who had either been broken by the discovery of his wife's affair or been promised something he wanted more than his wife, or both, and who stood in his own kitchen with his back turned while another man put his hands on her. And it was concealed finally by the purchase of one ambitious physician's conscience, by a small convenient fire in a basement archive, and by the slow, impatient passage of 147 years of forgetting. This mystery shows us that the most terrible things that have happened in this country have not been done by monsters from beyond the edge of the world. They have been done by ordinary men in ordinary rooms, in ordinary towns, protected by the ordinary silences of the people around them, and hidden finally by history's willingness to let certain names, certain places, and certain women be quietly erased from the record. Science cannot explain what happened to Ruth Payne, not because what happened to her was outside the laws of nature, but because the science of her time was used deliberately and with great skill to cover the tracks of what had been done. The men who killed her understood chemistry better than the doctor who tried to save her memory. The men who protected them understood the price of a conscience better than the men whose consciences were for sale. And the community around them understood, with the terrible practical wisdom of small places, that there are questions it is better for everyone concerned never to ask aloud. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has truly been revealed? Or do you think there are still details, still names, still letters in trunks and journals and cedar boxes, waiting to be found in some attic in upstate New York by some granddaughter who will this time refuse to sell? Leave your comment below. Tell us what you think Daniel Payne was doing in that kitchen, and whether you believe he knew, and whether you believe there is any forgiveness for a man who stands with his back turned, while someone puts their hands on his wife. If this tale has held you, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, so you never miss what we uncover next. And share this video with someone who understands that the darkest history is not the history we were taught in school, but the history that someone somewhere once went to very great trouble to ensure we would never hear. See you in the next video.